Hey, everybody. Welcome to a Mighty Blaze Friday Frontliner. I am here today with Jess Walter. Jess, welcome back to the Blaze.
Thank you, Jenna. Great to be here.
And we're so happy to have you back. For those of you who've been watching the Blaze for a minute, Jess first graced us with his presence when he was on with our thoughtful bro, Mark Cecil, to talk about his book, The Cold Millions. Today he's back with his latest novel, So Far Gone, which whenever I say the title of the book pops up next to me magically, and also next to Jess as well. And first, a few words about the Blaze for those of you who are repeat Blazers. Welcome back. Thank you for bringing your light to our Blaze. For those of you who are new here, we're a team of about 30 creative professional volunteers who came together during the age of COVID to bring you your favorite authors in your living room where you can watch them without even having to put on pants. Obviously, we've gone well beyond COVID now, and we are still bringing you new authors' books. And we are on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter, which I refuse to call X, on TikTok. We are ubiquitous. If you like what you see here, please consider giving us a like or follow or signing up on www.mightyblaze.com so you never have literary FOMO ever again. No mo FOMO. Nobody likes that. And now, without further ado, I am going to introduce Jess. You ready, Jess?
I'm ready.
All right. Okay. Let me read your official bio. Buckle up, you. Jess Walter is, now where's my iPad? The author of 10 books, most recently in the story collection. Okay, it just disappeared on me. Thank you, iPad. Digital bad, paper good. Most recently, the story collection Angel of Rome, and the best-selling authors, novels The Cold Millions, for which, again, we were lucky enough to have Jess on with Mark Cecil, and the beloved Beautiful Ruins, Zero, finalist for the National Book Award, and Citizen Vince, which is the winner of the Edgar Award. Jess's work has been published in 34 languages, and his short fiction has won O. Henry and Pushcart prizes and appeared 3 times in Best American Short Stories. His latest novel, So Far Gone, which just dropped this week on June 10th, has been praised by Ann Patchett as an American original, a marvel by Tom Perrotta, a buoyant, witty caper about gun-toting fundamentalists by the New York Times, which I promise you it actually is. It's not an oxymoron. It is a thing that exists. And a rollicking good time by Lauren Groff, which it also is. And yet, as we shall hear, So Far Gone also has very serious messages for us today as well. Jess, again, welcome back to the Blaze.
Thanks, Jenna. So nice to be here, and so glad you guys are in the world even beyond the pandemic. What a great show and a great idea.
Thank you so much, Jess. We absolutely love it. We love connecting readers and authors. Yeah. I'm glad I got that gauntlet out of the way because now we can talk about So Far Gone. Tell us what the book is about. It's so brand new that probably many of our audience members have bought it. Like I've seen people commenting, oh, I just bought this, but they haven't read it yet. So what are they in store for?
Yeah, the book kind of began as a thought experiment for me, just filled with all the dread of the news and the way the world seems to have closed in around us, especially through the technology through which so many of us get the news. That it's about a guy named Reese Kinnick who is fed up with the world and moves off the grid. He at a contentious Thanksgiving, he punches his son-in-law in the mouth for being a conspiracy theorist and throws his smartphone out the window and just retreats from the world. And it had that little bit of wish fulfillment. What if you could just turn your back on all of this stuff? But then the novel really begins on page 1 with him answering the door and finding his grandchildren there. He's seen them once in the last 7 years, and their mother has disappeared, and Reese has to come back out in the world and try to both redeem himself, but also save his family from some extremists who they've fallen in line with.
That's a great summary. Thank you. And I would like to share with our viewers and readers like how wonderfully funny this book is and how wonderfully salty. But let's start with that wish fulfillment. I know many of us watching have either rationed the news or wish we could ration the news or try not to read the news at night in bed, doom scrolling endlessly. And yet it's so difficult. Did you ever want to go off the grid yourself? And did you accomplish it, if so?
I saw this New Yorker cartoon that I couldn't look away, that really sort of encapsulated the way I was feeling. It's a car racing on a highway toward a sign that said, "Can't look away." And then there was a little off ramp that said, "Had enough." And I feel like throughout the last few years, I couldn't look away. I would, and part of it is the way the algorithm is built. It's supposed to keep us anxious and constantly looking for updates on what's happening. And so I very much felt this overwhelming feeling and this desire, that I'd had enough. I wanted to get off the road. For me, that's often a great starting point for fiction. And then I wanted to create a character who did a heightened version of that. I could never go off the grid like that. But Rhys Kinnick, this former environmental reporter, for him, it is, it's the path that he takes. The great thing for me about writing fiction, and the reason I think the novel is funny and it's heartfelt and it's about human beings, is that what starts out as political often really reveals its personal motivations. And what I realized about Rhys is that it's not just that he's fed up with politics and news and the world. It's really kind of, these things within himself that have sent him on this path. And once in the writing that I realized I had that, I realized I had a novel, because, we pick up novels because we become interested in the people. And in Rhys, I think he's a self-deprecating, sort of hapless hero, but who really wants nothing more than to bring his family back together.
Beautifully put. I think he's not necessarily an anti-hero. He's an every hero.
Yeah. Well, he's very much the sort of hero that I like to write, because I'm very much an accident-prone, comic realist who stumbles through life, sort of dealing with my own pain and my own issues by realizing the folly and the hubris of all humans. And so I think philosophically, I'm drawn to sort of those stories that make us look at the world and then realize that we are all connected in some way. And one of the ways, I think the best way that we're connected is in humor. I think if we can laugh at ourselves and laugh at the world around us, it starts to make more sense to us again.
I once was on the phone with a writer friend while I was walking my dog, talking animatedly about something, and I literally slipped on a banana peel and fell on a sidewalk and she heard the whole thing. She heard me go, whoa, and bonk and crash, and then the phone and all the swearing in the background. And I crawled back to my phone, and she was like, "You are literally the only person I ever knew who has actually fallen on a banana peel." So can you share, this is one of my off-script questions, but can you share one of your follies with us?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I've even given some of them to Rhys. He breaks his cheekbone, which I did playing basketball. And so, I got a stick in my eye when I was 5. I was and can't see out of my left eye. I've broken 13 bones. I live in an accident-prone, banana peel stumbling world, and I grew up in a family where the only thing you could do wrong was exhibit self-pity. And I remember my dad, I used to call him the sensei of dark humor, because all my life we grew up pretty poor, and I always wanted to go on a roller coaster. And when I was 7 or 8, we went to the World's Fair was in Spokane, in my hometown, and I was so excited to get on this roller coaster. And I sat down the roller coaster, they pulled the bar down, and I'd seen on the Brady Bunch that when you're on a roller coaster, you put your arms in the air. So immediately put my arms in the air. It started out, and I slammed my face against that bar, and they stopped it after about 3 feet. We didn't get any further because I was crying and spewing blood. And the carny picked me off the roller coaster, set me down, and I walked over and stood by my dad. And in this moment of sublime comic genius, he said, "How was it?" And even at 7 or 8, I spat laughter. I mean, I thought that was the funniest thing. And if we can't laugh at these hard moments, these hard times, the pains in our lives, we're not going to make it very far. And so I've always found humor as a great way to sort of puncture those things that sometimes fill us with self-deluded confidence, and with the desire to have the world conform to what we want it to be, because it's really not going to. And so we have to be able to laugh at the absurdities of the world while also hopefully making it a better place. And that's a tough balance, but it's what I strive for in my fiction.
It is, and you definitely achieved that. I wanted to ask how you did this, but first I will comment that your roller coaster adventure and your growing up sounds a little bit like Faulty Towers, like a sort of John Cleese, where you're always walking into the walls and then saying, "Well, never mind."
Yes,
How
right.
was it? It was bloody. It was windy. So great. Can you let's go to the book a little bit more,
Sure.
just so that readers get even more of a taste test of it. Talk to us about Reese and his family. And to give you some idea, guys, he calls his son-in-law shithead Shane. So
yeah,
we're going to talk a lot of swears today. It's going to be great.
Yeah. The Reese's daughter Bethany, who is sort of a brilliant chip off the old block, but she is she and her father have had this strained relationship, and one of them is what he calls her faulty taste in men. And so the first guy she dated was in an electronica band. His name is Sluggish Doug. So to go from a musician to shithead Shane, who is the new husband and is the one that Reese disagrees with at Thanksgiving and gets in a fight with at Thanksgiving. Shithead Shane is a character who is who has sort of followed this religious path to a place where he's Christian nationalism, militias, all those things make sense to him, and really conspiracy theories. He's really fallen in for conspiracy thinking. They have his daughter Bethany has two children, Leah, who's 13, and Asher, who is 9, and they're the kids who show up on his front porch, and immediately he's taken with them. Immediately he sees his face in their now growing faces. They're not toddlers and little kids anymore. He can recognize himself, and immediately Reese has this desire to reconnect. His daughter has gone missing though, and his 13-year-old granddaughter Leah has been betrothed to the 19-year-old pastor's son. And so in that, immediately I wanted to establish the stakes that Reese has to come out of this seclusion that he's thrown himself into, and hopefully track down his daughter and keep his children from disappearing into this militia church in the woods. And that felt like such a great place to start a novel. And then, as always happens, you just the characters just open up to you in this way that one of the things that I don't think I realized when I started the novel, but became one of my favorite elements, was understanding just what Reese's disappointment in his daughter would do to her. And when I got to that part of the novel, it really broke me up from both as a parent and a kid, realizing just how far these two could have drifted apart. And it was probably the hardest thing for me to imagine as a fiction writer, because there's nothing I love more than being a dad. And so imagining someone who had made mistakes and had allowed this fissure to grow between himself and his daughter so that he would only see her once in 7 years, those are the characters that can be hard to create for someone like me.
The relationship is really moving, and the psychological portraiture in this book is that sort of triple tiered one, where there's the foundation, and then there's the story that moves along, and then the sort of ripples of the themes on the surface that we're following and saying, oh my God, what's going to happen next? I got to see what's going to happen next. But then the foundation of it really is that relationship that Reese has with Bethany, and vice versa. And so through all the kerfuffle, which is not really the right word for it, but through all the contretemps with AOL, which is not AOL, but the Army of the Lord, he has an opportunity to reach Bethany and to try to make things right with her and with shithead Shane, which is great.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I read something that I'd love to ask about? I folded up the bottoms of so many of the pages, guys. Like I love this book, and it surprised me by how quickly it sucked me in, that beginning scene. And then also, like, you write the way people talk, and you write things that are funny, and they ring so true. So I want you guys to listen to this passage. It's on page 7 if you do have your book. You want to follow along, like in the hymnal. But it's Shane and his conspiracy theories. And so I wanted to see if this sounds familiar to anybody. So Reese tried to keep it casual, asking over the rim of his beer, "You're saying the National Football League is engaged in a massive conspiracy whose sole purpose is to deny victory to teams you happen to like?" "Got nothing to do with me," Shane said. "It's common knowledge that politics and professional football were rigged the same year, 2008, when the globalists put forward their final part of their plan. They've taken over universities, schools, every level of government, and they're about to give us a certain foreign president. His name, his middle name is Hussein. The final push. They were starting to control sports too. Don't forget, who won the Super Bowl that year?" "No idea," he said. 2008, the Giants beat the New England Patriots. Think about it for just a second, please. The Patriots, as in the real American, losing to the Giants of New York. Giants as in the beast that rises out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns, as in the 10 media companies and 7 boroughs of New York City. Come on, Reese, you're a smart man. Do you think this is all a coincidence? This is one of many passages I loved, even as I found myself maddened by it, because it sounded so familiar to me. Like, my family is all journalists and they're all liberal, but I have a family in the Midwest as well who are not, and did a lot of time in the Midwest storm chasing and being on book tour and listening to AM talk radio. And so I'm like, oh, I recognize a good conspiracy theory when I hear it.
Yeah.
What was it like for you to capture these conversations and these theories so verbatim, I would say, and then put them down on paper?
Yeah, some of them came from conversations with friends, and there was a specific conversation we were having about sports, and I said, well, wait a minute, so this whole conspiracy is built up to only punish the teams you happen to like, and it was both ludicrous to me, but also kind of understandable. Being a former journalist yourself, that the fracturing of all this information coming in, when more than 50% of people get their news from social media, what they're getting is this echo chamber of often conspiracies, of misinformation, and it's amazing what we will believe when it comes to us in this silo that we maybe live in. And so it's not surprising to me that we are so awash in conspiracy thinking on both sides, honestly. 30% of people believe that the COVID vaccine allowed microchips to be put into their bodies. The same percentage that believe that Barack Obama was not born in America. A quarter of people think that the assassination attempt on Donald Trump was a fabrication, that it never happened. We're being fed this information, and we have. And so for me, writing those characters was just sort of tapping into the zeitgeist, looking at what's spinning around out there, and then, discovering how people fall for it, what drives them into thinking these things are true. The real challenge, and the thing that I was the proudest of, was making these characters human beings, though, making them, finding the motivation behind how how this would happen, and then realizing the sort of similarities, really the almost mirror image that Reese puts up with his son-in-law. They're both seekers. They both have sort of turned away from the world and reality because of fear, because of what's motivated them, because their fear for their family and for the larger culture. So that for me, that was the place that I eventually got to. But the way I got there was just having great fun, writing those characters. And there's a moment where Reese thinks what Shane is really afraid of is this nightmare world where the socialists have caused everyone to poop in the wrong bathrooms. That's the end result of this giant conspiracy that he imagines the world is out to get. So it was, again, writing about it, but and remarking on how ludicrous it is, while also giving it the heft of kind of real conversations and real people.
I mean, it is scary to think about pooping in the wrong bathroom. If you've ever done that, it's like a terrible.
That's true. That is.
snipping on a banana peel, or
Right,
bonking your face
right.
on a roller coaster
That,
bar.
that
But
that is a dystopia that most of us cannot imagine. Exactly.
I cannot even countenance it. No, but the
Right.
Times said, and maybe our wonderful producer Karen can pop this into the chat. The Times review said that the characters who we think we're primed to think of as being sort of stereotypically conspiracy theorist or maybe ignorant in some way or whatever are actually very multi-layered characters, nuanced characters. It's like the number one praise that you can get in any writing circle ever is to say that this is a real person and not just some prototype. And it's true that as you spend time with the people in the novel, you get to, it's almost like they're weebles in some way, like you see the top part first that's really wobbling around and is drawing the attention, but then they are weighted at the base with their own humanity and their own hopes and fears. And
Yeah. It's really interesting. Sometimes the structure that I choose will help me find my way into the characters. And uh, this novel has both statements and questions. So Far Gone to me is a statement. Reese is so far gone. Shane is so far gone. Is the country so far gone? But it's also a question. Are we, yes, I want to. Are we too far gone? Can we come back from this? And each chapter, I began the first chapter, it's called chapter 1 is what happened to Kinnick. And that's both a question and a statement. It's so we find out what happened to him. We find, as I said, I tried to launch. I wanted it to be a propulsive novel where you start on page 1 and you go on a road trip, on a Charles Portis-like road trip. But I also wanted those questions to linger. What happened to Kinnick? How did he get here? But then in that chapter, we find out what happened to Kinnick. And I knew the whole time I was writing toward other characters. I was writing toward Asher and Leah, his grandchildren. I was writing toward Lucy, his incredibly profane ex-girlfriend, who's an editor at the newspaper still. And then I was writing toward Bethany and, how it feels to her to be married to this guy who is venturing out into a place even she doesn't want to be. And then eventually that I was writing toward Shane. And I think as fiction writers, think what it says about us that we may not even be able to imagine what it's like to have those characteristics. These are fellow Americans, people who live around us, and yet it's almost a failure of the creative imagination that one of the first questions people ask is, were you nervous about writing a character with these beliefs? And maybe it's more hubris on my part and more of my comic folly, but I feel like one of my jobs is try to imagine myself inside every kind of character I can think of and try to find, what their motivation is.
I think that's actually ultimately important because fiction is an act of empathy, which is what social media so often short circuits. We're so trained to look at tropes or fakes or whatever and to make knee-jerk assumptions. And fiction, with its longer form especially, is an antidote to that. It sounds like you were tunneling through one character to get to another character, and starting with Kinnick and then going to his daughter and the side characters and his family, and then finally to somebody who appears to be his polar opposite, but maybe is not so much. Are you a plotter or a pantser?
Am I a what?
Okay, I listen. A plotter or a pantser? So do you start out and let the novel take you wherever, by the seat of your pants, or are you?
I suppose I'm a little bit of both. I find myself, what really animates a novel for me is the characters. But I like to have a framework within which those characters will roam. And this novel, if you are going to write a road trip novel, a picaresque, an odyssey, then a few things are going to happen. You're going to cross some borders. And so this novel crosses into Idaho in a place called the Rampart, which is where the Army of the Lord trains, AOL. But then also we're going to cross the Canadian border and go to maybe the wildest music festival you've ever been to. And if you're going to have a journey like that, if it's going to be an odyssey, it's also going to return back home. And so that gave me a really natural, classic structure around which to get to know these characters. And that asking that question, what happened to each of them, was a way to open the novel up. The other thing that often animates me is the voice. Voice can be tied into point of view. And I knew I wanted a kind of an almost an omniscience, so it's an omniscient novel, but also that really it would mostly be Kinnick's novel. But as each person came in, you'd get this broadened version of who Kinnick is. Because at first you just see him with his own, witty repartee and taking his son-in-law down. And but then slowly you see what his grandchildren think of him, and you find out more. And then you find Lucy, his former lover, and what she thinks of him. And all the way until you get to Bethany, when I think by then you get a full, complete picture of this person. And it's the thing that I've found about writing first-person novels or short stories, is that's almost the least effective way to find out what a person is like, because you're only getting that internal version. You're only getting their excuses and their delusions. And to have the world look back at a character like Kinnick, that was one of the reasons that I wanted those, what happened to Shane, what happened to Bethany. I wanted those characters drawn in that way.
It's very humbling, I think, when you think about it. My own perspective on myself, one of my favorite things to do is to write characters like me from the outside, and I just think, oh, that just feels so good to get out of my own skin and look back at myself in a sort of a mirror. We talk about this a lot in my writing workshop about mirroring, but it's interesting because this book is so intimately told. It feels like it's first person, but it isn't. So you feel each person's mindset that you inhabit feels like first person, but of course we're getting like a sort of an omniscient lens, so we can step and see.
And that was sort of how I envisioned it as I was writing. It was almost like each person who comes into the party, as soon as they come in, we start with Kinnick, but then each person who comes to the party, I now have access. And so once, so a chapter that might begin, what happened to Lucy is not just from her point of view. She's just sort of come into the party as well. And it was, again, when we're writing, it can seem sometimes like we're trying to herd the entire world into our computer or our laptop, and having that almost visual sense of the structure, the shape of it, and how the structure cohere is so helpful for me when I start a book.
It is almost kaleidoscopic, and yet we're like imprinted on Reese pretty early on. So we know he's the maypole around which the rest of it revolves, which is great. But we do sort of go away and come back. And it's not disconcerting. I sometimes get annoyed if I'm pulled away from a character that I have come to really imprint on and really like. But I found it refreshing to get all the different perspectives. And I wanted to ask you about your side characters, because I think sometimes the books, if you don't have what I think of as the secondary characters, like the best supporting actors, you don't really miss them. But if you have really good ones, they can totally make the whole book in the way that the characters in Four Weddings and a Funeral, for instance, are actually more interesting than the lead actors. So I'm going to introduce the audience to a couple of them. In So Far Gone, we have Chuck, who is helping Reese navigate his way toward AOL and the Rampart, the Army of the Lord. And Chuck is described, sort of self-described, as an old, tired, half-horny, twice-divorced cop with bad knees, 3 estranged kids, and emotional regulation and bipolar issues. And I think he's so funny and one of those great characters who allows you to go off the reservation. And he is perhaps or perhaps not embroiled with Lucy, who's Reese's ex, who's a hard-boiled journalist, and her ex-husband calls her 110 pounds of verbal rage, to which she responds, 106, you fucking asshole. And I was like, this is my girl, I got you, girl. And there's some great commentary on journalism too from her perspective. And then we also have Reese's friends, Joni and Brian is Salish. Am I pronouncing that right? Salish, Native American. And so I wanted to ask you about these characters whose heads we also inhabit as not only part of being able to see who Reese is from the outside, but a sort of kaleidoscope of Americana, I guess, if that isn't the most pretentious phrase you've ever heard. How did those people come to you, or did you think, I have to make up this sort of carousel of people so that we can see Reese from outside and carry the plot ball forward? Like how did they come into the story?
Yeah, one of the things I love about fiction writing is to to inhabit those different voices, and it's funny you talked about side characters, because those great character actors in Hollywood. It's sometimes how I think of myself as a writer. Like, I would love this juicy side role where I play a bipolar detective, who you're only halfway down the road with him when you realize I don't think he knows what he's doing. I think things are only going to get worse. And so, those kinds of characters to me are so much fun to bring up. And yeah, I grew up, the house that Reese runs away to is a house that I lived in as a kid and still exists. A cinder block house, northwest of Spokane, just off the Spokane Indian Reservation. And it was where I lived as a kid. And my family has owned that land for more than 50 years. And so it was really easy to send him there. And then, and then to have his one friend be a member of the Spokane tribe who lives not far away, but is furious with him because he has expressed his love for Brian's girlfriend, Joni. And I didn't want any relationship in the book to be set or pat. I wanted them all to have that fissure between them. These are creases that all have to sort of be smoothed before we can get to the end of the novel, including, this love triangle, probably the most unlikely love triangle between Lucy, Chuck, and Kinnick. She suddenly has to get two of her boyfriends together, ex-boyfriends together. And not to give too much away, but one of my favorite moments in the book is when she has to decide between, when she's thinking about these two men, and she uses this great metaphor that she says, when you're trying to find a corkscrew and you just keep opening the same drawer, and she thinks maybe it's time romantically that she tried a different drawer. And so having, it was great imagining, dropping the characters in who come in already with so much loaded emotion, like Chuck and Lucy and Brian and Joni, and they're also great. When you're writing a novel that is a road trip or an odyssey, you also have to give your hero some allies, and I wanted him to have allies just as flawed as he is.
Yeah, wouldn't it be awful to have an ally who was perfect?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't know, but I know.
I don't think that
else
exists. But if I suddenly had somebody who was perfect riding shotgun with me while I was going up to the rampart to confront the army of the Lord people, it would be really annoying. No, I loved all of them, and I thought they were so real. My mom, God rest her, was an avid reader and also had the attention span of a toddler, and would throw books across the room and say ho hum if a book didn't hold her attention. So if I gave her an early draft of my own work, and she didn't ho hum it, it was like, it was good to go. I know I've done something. And the opposite of that is she would sometimes call me, because that was in the days before texting, and she would say, such and such a character is so real. This character is so real. And she would say that about I'm waving to my bookshelves too. She would say that about characters who we read in common and loved, like Larry McMurtry had all these characters, like they're just so real. And I think she would have said that about the characters in the book, and probably she would have wanted to date Chuck and Nick. I think that was her jam. But I felt that Joni and Brian especially seemed, when they talked to each other, their marital language was like so familiar, where they're kind of like ribbing each other affectionately, like that there's so much affection there. Here's a coward writer question. Like, in this day and age, was it at all trepidatious, which is probably a word I made up, to write Native American characters?
No, I'm a big believer. I write short stories, and I often write them from different genders, different ethnicities. I think there's a way to write characters that the first thing about them is their humanity, and not their political beliefs, not their where they're from. I would never set out to write the great Native American novel, but I think sometimes of people feeling the limitation of writing characters outside their particular set of experience or the world that they're from. And I think what a boring world that would be. Do you remember the movie Being John Malkovich, where he all of a sudden everyone is John Malkovich? You know, I mean, I would write a novel just peopled with accident prone, well-meaning, you know, late middle-aged white guys like myself, and it would be, I mean, what a dreary world that would be. So I think we have to try to depict humanity in its fullness, and to write a novel set in Spokane, which was named for the tribe that was driven from it, like so many places, and not acknowledge the fact that you know, that Native Americans still make up a huge part of the tapestry of the world I'm from. To me, that would feel worse than, you know, and I never think that my characters represent anything except themselves. Brian is not representative of what a Native American man in the year 2025 would necessarily say, any more than Kinnick is representative of every left-leaning person who's frustrated with the world, any more than Shane is representative of everyone who believes Christianity and patriotism belong on the same plate. You know, everyone is an individual, but when you create a novel, I think the place to connect with them is in their humanity.
I could not agree more.
The common things we share, you know. And for me, sense of humor is the most, I'm the most reverent about sense of humor. And so most of the characters that I write about have that in common, you know, and you know, Brian has a very dry sense of humor that I think I connect with as much as I do Kinnick's.
Reverent about irreverence.
Yes, reverent about irreverence. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And starting with the people first, and then maybe the beliefs are like what's painted on, I guess. Yeah. How do you write funny? How do you do that?
You know, I desperately try not to think about it. And I have a good friend, a novelist that you should read named Jim Lynch. And Jim once said to me, "You write stand-up tragedy." And I thought that was the greatest phrase, because I do write toward pathos and toward the heartbreak that it is to be alive, and I do it in a way that comes naturally to me, because again, it's, you know, I'm a 8-year-old boy standing next to my dad bleeding from bashing my head against the roller coaster I didn't get to ride, and the first thing he says was, "How was it?" You know, and that's both heartbreaking and hilarious. And you know, the topics in this book, for some people, they won't seem funny on the surface. You know, it's like, I'm not sure I want to laugh about this. Totally fine. But for me, the heartbreak of the world we're in now intersects very cleanly with the lunacy of much of it, and and our desire to get back to a place that is that feels safer and more reasonable.
Well, I just had this big wave of sadness rush over me, thinking about recent events and thinking about what could make that funny. You know, like, can a handcuffed senator just like sit up from the floor and just start laughing and be like, "This is ridiculous"? You know, it's like, I slipped on a banana peel. I mean, I wish we could. I mean,
many of the books that I love, Catch-22. I mean, what was funny about World War II? Slaughterhouse-Five. You know, the writer Celine, who could find amazing humor in World War I. You know, I mean, I think without the capacity to look at, again, at human folly, that I think we lose perspective without our sense of humor. You know, I think it's such a vital part of what keeps us sane.
I agree. I think the big picture stuff, I'm having this revelation while I'm talking to you, which may or may not be anything at all, but I feel like the big picture stuff is sad or absurd, or, you know, the larger movement of what's happening around us. But if you keep your eye on the people are always funny. people, individuals are always funny or silly in some way because we're people. We're like these animals, slipping on banana peels and falling down. So maybe that's the key, is to like look small, like look at them.
And I think that's where the tragedy part of stand-up tragedy comes in. You are writing those, in the classic Shakespearean sense, you're finding the fatal flaw in humanity that causes us to keep trying and failing and trying and failing. And in our trying, I think we approach a kind of divinity. I think we approach the best version of ourselves when we know where it all ends and we know that we come up short. But there's something about that constant effort to get back up after we've slipped on the banana peel that's where I find the real beauty in human nature and in fictional characters.
And to do a little better, slip better, I guess.
Slip better next time. Yeah.
Slip better next time. I will ask a couple more questions that I've been carrying around with me since I first had the pleasure of reading the book earlier this spring, and then I will open it up to the floor just for a couple of audience questions. So last time you were on Blazed, when you were with our thoughtful bro, Mark, you guys had this great conversation, Jenna, because I got to produce about what a social novel is, why you wrote it, social novel, like what are they supposed to do? Did you think you had written them? And the social novels you admired. And I would say So Far Gone it read to me, despite the beauty of the human foibles we've been talking about, it was in its scope and in its themes a political novel. And I will ask you that very boring question that I assume you will get asked a lot on tour, is in this environment, did you have any compunction about writing something that would be seen as a political novel? Because it's scary.
Yeah, of course. And I've already had someone say, "Oh, I don't need any more reality. I'm turning away from it." And I know some people read for escape. I totally get that. I feel like as a novelist, I can't pretend the world doesn't exist as it exists. And in the 1960s and early 70s, there was what was called the generation gap, and young people and old people looking at a totally different world. And we have that similar thing now. And so it scared me a little. And when as an artist, when something scares me, I think it's probably what I should do. It's probably the thing I should, it's probably that important to find my way toward it. But I think the novel is only political in the way that politics affects our lives now. I don't think I'm the only person who's ever imagined a Thanksgiving that goes awry because of political talk. They probably don't always end with fisticuffs, but I think we're experiencing that, and I think that's worth writing about. So, and again, then writing about it in a way that it's funny because I sort of get credit for writing a whole bunch of different genres. Some of my books you could classify as mysteries or crime novels. Some are romantic, but I've become a sort of genre agnostic. I allow other people to define them, but I just want to write big human stories that follow the logic of their own structure. And this one was very much that propulsive road trip story, that picaresque, where wild characters come on board and help us get to this goal we're arriving at. Does that mean is it a political novel also? I guess, but only because it's impossible for me to imagine a life in 2025 that doesn't have some aspect of politics attached to it.
Yeah, and I don't want that to scare anybody off, what I said either about the politics. I think that most of us are in this fishbowl anyway, where we're swimming around in the politics of our time. And whenever anybody says I'm not political, I'm like, yeah, you are. Actually, the air that you breathe in your country, like how you get your food delivered to you, is a direct result of the politics of your country or your medicine or your job or so whether you acknowledge it or not, you are. And I feel like it's such a relief to read a book about the issues that are so divisive and yet make it manageable by bringing it down to human size. I feel like it's almost like Sideways, like that wonderful Alexander Payne movie about the guy going on a trip with his best man and through wine country, except in this case, it just happens to be going to save somebody from.
Another good road trip. And road trip stories are always about that sort of self-discovery. And I think one of the things that's made me the happiest is some people said I was a little scared to read it because of, because it's so contemporary, because it's about things that are happening now. But but then there's a sort of double catharsis. The first one is watching Reese express all this frustration, and then the second one, I think people quickly realize that it doesn't wallow in that stuff. It actually sort of uses it as a beginning point, and then goes deep into the place that we like fiction to go, hopefully.
Yeah, to see how the people relate to each other, how do they get out of their own psychological.
I hope so. But if I've learned anything else from 11 books, it's that not every book is for every reader either. So it will never hurt my feelings if a reader decides to read something else. Just make sure it's something good. That's all I ask.
Right. And I would say, if you decide to do that, then give this book away to somebody else who will enjoy it and disseminate it in the world. You're a much kinder person than I am. I'm like, you don't like my book? That's fine. Buy 5 copies of it and give it to other people, and then go read it. Yes. Okay, let's take a couple of audience questions, because we have the pleasure of your company only for a couple more minutes. So Sylvia, hi Sylvia, wants to know, when you're developing characters, how do you know when enough is enough for the reader to grasp the persona? What a great question.
That is a great question, and it's a tricky one, obviously. I have a few ideas that work for me. One is, a lot of times when I was first writing fiction, I would create these elaborate backstories for characters. And then I would start with them answering the door, and then you'd find out their whole big backstory. It's something fascinating in there. And I would think, why am I putting the best part in backstory? Why shouldn't that be the story? And if I'm meeting an inert character who the main thing about them happened 30 years ago, that might not be the time to meet that person, and so that's one thing. I try not to overload too much backstory. And then there's a phrase that actors sometimes they say, when they're looking for a character, they try to find a hat, like an item of clothing, or one thing that you think about them that, and so for Lucy, it's, the thing she wears is that profanity. Her husband at the time was always saying, "Language, Lucy," because you work in a newsroom, it can be very salty, and then you come home and you've got children, and you're, so that's not the only aspect of her character, but I often look for a hat, for that one thing that defines that character, that allows me access. Well, what is that language? Where does that come from Lucy? It comes from this disappointment of the life she's led, the kind of, being in a career journalism that is sort of crumbling out from under her. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so using that first element that I use to sort of define characters as a way to kind of open up who they are. When enough is enough is when I know them so well that I feel like, I can predict what they'll say, how they'll act. And then, like everything, I think being concise in fiction, I always try to take a pass through and make sure that at some point I'm not giving you information you don't need.
Mm-hmm. Take some of the stuff off the plate.
Yeah.
That was worth the price of admission right there, people. The hat. Did the hat come to you as a sort of a gift from the cloud, or do you actively sort of scope the horizon for the hat?
It's my process is that when I first meet a character, I don't know them that well. And then the process of writing the book, writing a book is discovering what the book is. Many times you go out on a book tour and you feel the questions make you think that they imagine you knew from beginning to end what the story was, and that it was just a long process of typing it, and in fact, writing a book is discovering what it is. And that's the people too. If you better not know your characters the first time you type something about them. But the first time it occurred to me, I was writing a novel called Citizen Vince, and he wakes up in the morning and he's getting dressed, and I described he's puts on a shirt and he snaps his cuffs like a Vegas dealer, and I described him as being narrow in the waist and broad in the shoulders like a martini glass. And immediately I knew him. I knew he had a dry sense of humor like a martini. I knew that he had a kind of sharpness that was different than the circumstances he was in. And from that moment, that just gives you access into the character. So the hat is not the end of their, and for him, his martini glass shape was the thing that allowed me into him. For Kinnick, he's a much easier character because he's a recluse, and that reclusivity is the pathway into him. And then you'd better get to know him a heck of a lot better. And by the end, his reclusivity was almost the least interesting thing. The interesting thing was this sorrow over his career and this all these choices he'd made that had led him to this, to throw himself out in the woods. It's great joy meeting your fictional characters and getting to know them better. And it's why we have to revise and revise, because once we know them, we have to go back to the beginning, and use that knowledge to really inhabit them in a way we couldn't have when we started.
And then it seems so far away, right? By the time you get to the end of a novel and you look at the beginning, that telescope, and you think, oh my God, I wrote that like 200 years ago, at least.
No, right. It's so far gone by that point.
It's so far gone. All right. Yeah. Do we have any more questions, Karen? I'm sure you have more questions. Are you working on another book already? And if so, can you give us a sneak peek?
I always work on another book. I tend to work on 2 or 3 things at once, which is not very common, but for me, it helps to start something. And then I love walking away from something. The book that I'm the most known for, Beautiful Ruins, I worked on for 15 years. There were 3 other books that sort of rose up in that time. And so I was working on I call them mothership books, because they're just floating up there, and then smaller books kind of emerge from them. The big mothership I'm working on is about a love triangle, which is another sort of classic thing to write about. And it's about, my loves are basketball and writing. And so it's about 2 writers and a basketball player in a love triangle. And for each of them, I think their ambition in the thing they want to do is far more of a threat than any of the other people in the love triangle. They're all, if you want to be a professional basketball player or a writer, you know how long the odds are. And so you want this thing maybe more than any relationship. So that's what I'm working on next.
Okay, literally sold already. Everybody here is like, does it have a title? I almost don't want to know in some ways, but you can share.
I almost don't want to say it. So
yeah, don't say it. Yeah, guys,
it has a working title, but I think it looks better on the page than if I were to say it out loud. And if it ends up being called something else, which it undoubtedly will, then we'll all be disappointed.
Yeah, no, don't. I almost, as soon as I said that question, I resented it. I regretted it. What is going on with my brain today? Because I feel like there's such a talismanic property to a title, especially when it's a work in progress. So forget it. But guys, go to Bookshop and get notified about whatever Jess writes next, because then you'll know the title before anybody else. Actually, Miriam asked, how do you know your titles? Great question.
I often don't know the title. I like it to emerge from the novel. At various times, this book was called What Happened, which is, as I said, each chapter. And I thought What Happened might be a great title, again, because it works as and then the title came to me. I was writing about what Reese's granddaughter and what Reese's daughter thought when she went to visit him during the pandemic. She thought, oh, he's so far gone. And I liked, if you look at that, if you're a writing nerd, 3 one-syllable words, 2 letters, 3 letters, 4 letters, the sentence itself kind of goes someplace. And then late in the book, there's a character who's in a nursing home, and he's so far gone that they can't really reach him. And that resonance of that moment, and the sort of comic question it asks, and the fearful idea that we might be so far gone, we can't bring this all back together. It just felt to me like the right one. But I was probably 2/3 of the way through. Beautiful Ruins at one time was called The Hotel Adequate View.
I love that also.
And I had that title on it for about 9 years before I stumbled across the real one. So like the characters, like the story, the title is usually something that I encounter in my writing and thinking and my journaling. I don't know if I get them all right, but by the end, like people, you couldn't imagine them named anything else.
Right. Yeah. And it's all part of the process, the joy of discovery of writing the book and what it teaches you in that process.
Yeah.
So at the risk of being a sort of a downer question, I guess, I wanted to know, we love this title. Are we too far gone, do you think? The book doesn't think so, but I'm asking somebody who's been...
I have to warn you, my son, who just came I'm in Seattle. I just did a reading at, I've done a couple of readings here, and my son came to one because he lives in Seattle now. And he sometimes describes me as a toxic optimist. So in my optimistic toxicity, I would say no. I really have great faith in humanity and in people to find common ground. And it's heartbreaking to me that we live in a time when it feels like we are so far apart. But I really do think that this will pass. Having written historical fiction too, and seeing just how dire things can feel, how irreversible they can feel, to see that things do come around. I am doing the best I can to stay in great shape, because I want to be here to see when we have common cause again, and when it feels like we aren't riven the way we are by so many issues right now.
Thank you. I love that. Thank you for being an oxymoron, a toxic optimist, a stand-up tragedist. Guys, thank you for watching today, and go out and buy at least 5 or 6 copies of So Far Gone. It is, by the way, a great Father's Day gift, I will say.
Yeah.
Like, good dad energy in this. I absolutely love it. But it also is a read that will make you laugh. And if you feel like your face is pressed up against the news all the time, it's something that will make you laugh in the face of it. And it's so warm and it's so funny, and we're so grateful to have you on today.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you.
Watch out for banana peels out there on the.
I will. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.